And the Winter Olympics were two of the biggest sporting spectacles this year. Events that showcase athletic achievement while also shining the spotlight on issues host nations would prefer to keep private. And that's where we begin our countdown of the top news stories of 2022 with number 10 tonight, CTV's Heather Wright, on how politics, sport, and diplomacy mixed on a global scale.
Boycott, Beijing Olympics!
As the clock ticked down to the Beijing Olympics, calls to boycott the Games grew louder.
We are all under the oppressions of Chinese government.
Genocide against the Uyghurs, atrocities in Tibet, violent crackdowns on free speech.
We are extremely concerned by the repeated human rights violations by the Chinese government.
Several countries, including Canada, announced a diplomatic boycott, a move met with disdain by Beijing. Their organizing committee spokesman said the concerns were made up, as he urged the world to instead focus on the spectacle of the Olympics. And for the third straight Olympics, Russian athletes were banned from competing under their country's flag, punishment for its state-sponsored doping program, not for its invasion of Ukraine, which happened just 4 days after the closing ceremony. It was also during this time that American basketball player Brittany Griner was detained in Moscow and charged with drug possession. In August, she was sentenced to 9 years in prison, a bargaining chip in the increasingly hostile relationship between Moscow and Washington.
She's on the ground.
Stop it.
Earlier this month, the 32-year-old was released in a prisoner swap with notorious arms dealer Victor Bout, known as the Merchant of Death.
Nobody's doing backflips over here about the fact that Mr. Bout is a free man.
The U.S. had hoped for a 2-for-1 deal that would have included Canadian-born Paul Whelan. In the end, though, only Griner made it home. Her case, an example of hostage diplomacy, while sport diplomacy was on full display for 29 days in Qatar. Never has so much money been spent to host a World Cup, the first in the Arab world.
The winner is Qatar.
The tiny Gulf state set out a decade ago to elevate its stature by hosting a glitzy tournament, highlighting its role as a diplomatic broker and increasing its international visibility. But the attention was not always the kind it wanted.
What is happening is reputational laundering.
From the get-go, Qatar's World Cup was mired in controversy, with allegations of bribery and corruption, and questions about why FIFA's marquee tournament was given to a country where it's illegal to be gay, and women's rights are frequently violated.
I went to Qatar with the hope of bettering my life.
Human rights groups quickly sounded the alarm over Qatar's treatment of migrant workers. Thousands are believed to have died building the infrastructure needed to host soccer's biggest tournament.
Today I feel gay.
FIFA boss Gianni Infantino tried to address some of the criticism leveled against the host country the day before kickoff, in a speech widely panned as disrespectful and hypocritical. His promises of inclusion further undermined when at the last minute, FIFA threatened a yellow card to any captain wearing the One Love rainbow armband in support of LGBTQ2S+ rights. In their first match, Iran's soccer team brought politics directly to the pitch, refusing to sing their national anthem, a show of solidarity with protests back home. Some diplomacy was overt. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sat with the Emir of Qatar at the opening ceremony, a sign of thawing tensions between the two neighbors. And while no major Western leader attended the opening ceremony, top officials from around the world streamed through Qatar over the course of the tournament. For the first time ever, there were direct flights from Tel Aviv to Doha. A demand made by FIFA, it's not a sign of normalizing relations, but perhaps it's a step.
A heartbeat, and Messi!
In the end, Qatar's World Cup might be remembered for the final, what many have called the greatest soccer match ever. Others hope the legacy goes further, and that labor reforms finally implemented by the Qataris stay. But even if countries can't always get along, their citizens can.
It's a time for easing tensions between nations.
Brought together by the power of sport. Heather Wright, CTV News, Toronto.
when thousands of women took to the streets to assert their power this year. Whether it was standing up to oppressive regimes in Iran and Afghanistan, or closer to home, with American women rallying for abortion rights, women are the focus tonight at number 9 of our top news stories of the year. CTV's Washington Bureau Chief Joy Malbon with how 2022 became the year of women's resistance.
This year, women around the world said enough. They stood up in America for access to safe and legal abortions.
We are not going back.
After the Supreme Court struck down what was considered the law of the land for 50 years. In Iran, they took to the streets, demanding their freedoms back in a bold and dangerous uprising, facing fists and even worse, at the hands of a brutal religious regime. Women cutting their hair in defiance, burning their headscarves, sparking a global outcry.
Well, this protest is not just about hijab. It's about freedom. It's about democracy. However, the women, young women, are spearheading that.
And heard loudly across Canada.
We have to show support for people back home. They're fighting for their freedom.
In Afghanistan, the resistance can mean beatings and death. Chanting, work, work, freedom. Women are standing up to the most oppressive regime on the planet, the Taliban. Stripped of their rights to education and jobs, even shut out of amusement parks.
The Taliban want women to be invisible. Despite initial promises to protect women's rights, years of progress are being rolled back.
And yet, united in their struggle, women have refused to give up, even as Iran's crackdown grows more brutal. For months, they've raged against the regime, triggered by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, arrested by the feared morality police who enforce a strict dress code. She died in custody.
The conservative estimate of the death toll so far stands at over 300, including at least 40 children. This is unacceptable. We are now in a full-fledged human rights crisis.
The faces of the fallen seen here in Washington, young men and women, a brave new generation, says Shireen Nariman, who survived 2 years in an Iranian prison herself.
They say it, they shout. They said, this is not just a protest. This is a revolution itself.
And say women everywhere, a necessary revolution. Online hate, especially targeting women, is on the rise. Sexual assaults in Canada are way up. In America, the home of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was targeted. Not to mention, threats against prominent female lawmakers have escalated. And in a year where 1 in 3 American women lost access to abortion in their state, outrage.
What it means that now legally the status of women in America is breeder and incubator. And I was furious and I was determined to get up and get in these streets and call people into these streets to fight.
And they did. Anger drove many Americans to the voting booth in all 5 states where reproductive rights were on the ballot in the midterm elections. Victory.
The government should not be telling a woman what to do with her body.
Battles for rights and freedoms that women have fought for long ago and are still fighting. Joy Malbon, CTV News, Washington. Escaping conflict is a prime motivator for migrants, and 2022 saw migration on a massive scale. Russia's invasion of Ukraine forced nearly 8 million people to flee to neighboring countries. For vulnerable Afghans, their goal was to stay out of the Taliban's reach. The struggle of the world's displaced is number 7 in our top 10 stories of the year. Here's CTV's Geneviève Beauchemin.
Not since the Second World War had Europe seen a refugee crisis on this scale. Train after train left Ukraine, most heading to the Polish border. To millions, the Medyka border crossing became a gateway to some peace as bombs dropped on their homes. I took my children and we're fleeing because I want to save them, said Christina as the conflict broke out. A month of war forced 1/4 of Ukraine's children out of the country. This video capturing one escape. A mom telling her child, run fast, don't cry, run fast. The long, dangerous journey out marked just the beginning of a months-long ordeal.
Nothing can be important than my family.
Many of those who had grabbed whatever they could carry across left so much behind. 90% of Ukrainian refugees are women and children, men 18 to 60 banned from leaving the country.
What makes it so unique, this crisis here, is that the refugees are almost all women and children, and that makes them very vulnerable.
Some of the refugees found shelter in Europe. We met this family in Finland.
I'm grateful that I am here, but I really hope that I'll go back to my home.
Canada opened its doors. More than 100,000 Ukrainians have already arrived.
This is hers.
For Afghan refugees, the process has been far slower. Around 27,000 have landed on Canadian soil since the fall of Kabul nearly a year and a half ago.
My final destination is Toronto.
Over the past few weeks, some flights have arrived, with refugees granted asylum on humanitarian grounds or for those who worked with Canada in Afghanistan. But tens of thousands more have fled and found temporary refuge in Pakistan. We hope Canada or another country can take us in, says this mom of 5. They're now in limbo as they wait for Canada to process their applications.
Just going seconds, minutes, hours, days, nights, but nothing special.
Refugees wait, not allowed to work.
Please take out your pencil.
Their children unable to go to school, as they and others forced to leave their homes behind dream of a more peaceful life. Geneviève Beauchemin, CTV News, Montreal.
After yesterday's heavy flooding that killed at least 8 people. Rescue workers waded in chest-deep waters, holding onto a rope to carry children and infants from flooded homes. Tens of thousands have been forced to higher ground. From flooding to raging heat waves and crippling ice storms, extreme weather is becoming more severe and is happening more often. In 2022, countries across the globe were hit hard with deadly natural disasters that claimed lives and caused extensive damage. The climate carnage is number 6 in our top 10 stories of the year. With more, here's CTV's Atlantic Bureau Chief Creason Ajkate.
2022 was another reminder of the planet in dire distress as climate change continues to devastate so many lives. Somalia suffered the worst drought in 40 years. Livestock are dying, and now more than 4.3 million are in need of food and safe drinking water.
This should be a global concern because climate change is not the responsibility of one country.
Hundreds of wildlife in Kenya have also died from the heat, including this elephant that was shot after it killed a woman while desperately looking for water. In South Africa, flash flooding killed more than 400 people and left tens of thousands more homeless. And in Pakistan, flooding there has created an economic crisis, killing hundreds and causing $32 billion in damages.
Millions of people are going into winter without the shelter.
Dangerous heat waves caused a national emergency in Britain, closing airport and train services.
This weather is absolutely unprecedented. We have never seen anything like these temperatures in our models before.
Spain and Portugal set a new July record of 47 degrees, which sparked out-of-control wildfires. This man nearly lost his life while trying to protect his town. High winds were also the issue in Atlantic Canada.
The devastation looks to be beyond anything that we have witnessed before.
Hurricane Fiona threw homes into the ocean, snapped thousands of trees, and knocked out power for weeks.
I saw 4 or 5 buildings float past while we were here trying to deal with this.
It's heartbreak. It's devastation.
So far, Fiona has caused $660 million in damage, making it the most costly extreme weather event ever recorded in the region.
The reality is, with climate change, there are going to be more extreme weather events with a greater intensity.
In Puerto Rico, that same storm caused $2 billion in damages and left millions without power.
I'm determined to help Puerto Rico build faster than in the past and stronger and better prepared for the future.
In the spring, Ontario saw winds reach up to 195 kilometers, killing 11 people. It was later confirmed an EF2 tornado caused the damage. This massive tree came crashing down where this woman's daughter was sitting.
I've never thought I was going to go through this in my life. Never.
Manitoba saw the third highest snowfall since 1872, leaving rivers to overflow with homes looking like islands on the prairies. 45 municipalities and 9 First Nations all declared a state of emergency.
It's just too much rain. It's too much moisture. We don't need it.
In the U.S., a 23-year drought dried up more farmlands.
Oh, no.
And brought more wildfires to people's doorsteps, like here in Arizona.
This was taken at 12:25 p.m. You can see 12:28. That's 3 minutes later.
It happened so fast. To see like everything burned is just very traumatic.
At COP15 in Montreal, countries agreed to protect 30% of land and water by 2030.
We would have accomplished everything that is in this agreement. It will be a very different planet, and it's going to be a major change.
But leaders struggled on what protection looks like and who will pay for it. Drastic change is needed quickly, as experts are predicting another dry year.
That worries me because, that often gives you a sense of what the forest fire season is going to be like, what growing is going to be like.
Chris Anachkate, CTV News, Halifax.
It's been a throwback year for the economy, an inflation surge not seen since the 1980s. It's number 5 in our top 10 stories of 2022. Here's CTV's John Venevali Rao.
As the year began, Canadians who thought gas prices were already too high had no idea just how much worse things were going to get.
I'm a small contractor, so it cuts into the profit for sure.
In January, when we talked to analyst Dan McTague, he made what back then seemed to be a jaw-dropping prediction, that nationally on average gas could hit $1.65.
Wow, are you kidding me?
But by April, it was well over that, and in June, even higher, reaching $2.36 in Vancouver.
It's stunning to me how much gas costs right now. It's stunning.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine and rising global demand for oil were in part to blame. And sky-high fuel prices on top of supply chain issues added to the cost of just about everything from food to furniture to flowers.
Some things are so pricey, we just say, okay, pass, wait till it comes down.
While central bankers had thought high inflation would be transitory or relatively short-lived, they were wrong. By June, year over year, the Consumer Price Index rose more than 8%. At the grocery store, things were worse. Prices shot up more than 10%. For some, it meant making tough choices.
Pretty much every time you come, the prices are higher. And if it's not higher, you get less.
Shrinkflation became a thing, where products shrank in size but not in price.
There you go.
Thank you very much. And more people turned to food banks for help.
For the past month, we saw a record high of 12,000 hampers needing to be provided out into the community.
And then there were the accusations that grocery chains were price gouging while making record profits.
Almost 4 Canadians out of 5 believe that grocers are profiteering.
By October, Loblaws announced it planned to freeze prices on no-name products until the end of January. While earlier in the year, in response to inflation, the Bank of Canada began raising rates to try and cool the economy, acknowledging it had waited too long.
The economy is strong. It can handle higher interest rates. It needs higher interest rates.
The trend-setting rate that started the year at near 0% surged by December to over 4%, the fastest rate rise in 40 years, making mortgages much more expensive. And Canadians saw interest payments go way up, in some cases more than $1,000 a month.
It's a very, very uncertain times and very scary.
Some even worrying they'd have to sell at the worst time possible, as home prices in many markets plunged from their peak.
Say, for example, if the bank comes to me and says, okay, from next month onwards, your mortgage is $3,000, I cannot afford to pay $3,000. The only option at that point I would have is to sell the property.
Meanwhile, according to one report, rent prices on average went up 15%.
They're insane. It's so expensive to rent.
Average wage hikes did not keep up with inflation, meaning Canadian consumers had much less buying power by the end of 2022. And while many are expecting inflation to ease somewhat in 2023, a recent report is predicting food prices may rise another 7%. John Valley-Rouse, CTV News, Toronto.
Arrive now at number 3 in our countdown of the year's top 10 stories, the perils of Putin's war in Ukraine. Chief international correspondent Paul Workman on the conflict and cascading risk.
With a thunderous arrival from the sky, Russia began its massed advance and nakedly aggressive attack on a peaceful neighbor. President Vladimir Putin refused then to call it a war and still won't. We have launched a special military operation, he announced, to demilitarize Ukraine and cleanse it of Nazis. Just days earlier, Ukraine's young president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was greeting visitors in a suit and tie, soon transformed into a bearded and enormously popular wartime leader dressed in fatigues. Russian forces attacked from air, land, and sea, foolishly confident of victory in mere days. Ukraine had a different idea. This is our land, our country, and we will defend it, said a defiant Zelensky. I am here, I am not leaving. If Putin's cynical intention was to cause a refugee stampede, it was immediate and overwhelming. Panicky guards fired shots in the air at Kyiv's central train station. Within weeks, some 8 million Ukrainians scrambled to leave the country on a scale not seen since the Second World War. Even as Russia inflicted horrendous suffering on Ukraine, this was a maternity hospital, its grand invasion plan faltered from the beginning. By springtime, Russia's army in the northeast made a full and humiliating retreat. And that's when the world saw the horror of Bucha and other destroyed towns, evidence of torture, indiscriminate killing, in all likelihood, war crimes. In May, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reopened the Canadian Embassy in Kyiv, one of a succession of leaders who made hush-hush visits to support Ukraine in person. By late summer, Ukraine was on the attack, liberating territory north and south. The city of Kharkiv was suddenly out of Russian artillery range, offering bittersweet relief amid the wreckage of lives and property.
Where will you go?
I don't know.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Facing disgrace on the battlefield, Putin turned to showy propaganda, formally announcing that 4 regions of Ukraine were now and forever would be part of Russia. Then came Ukraine's greatest act of sabotage, though never acknowledged, the fiery bombing of a multi-lane bridge connecting Russia to Crimea. In a fury of revenge, Putin opened a ruthless new phase in the war, sending waves of missiles and drones to cripple Ukraine's energy system. A winter of suffering had begun.
I'm Paul Workman. Nice to see you.
A few days later, Zelensky sat down for an interview with Canadian television networks, showing no less determination than all those months earlier.
There must be peace, no war, and that will happen. And the people who committed this war have to be held responsible, and that will happen.
By year's end, Russia had launched more than 1,100 rockets and drones at Ukraine, leaving millions to freeze and suffer in the dark in a war grinding towards a second year. Paul Workman, CTV News, London.
A disruption in the nation's capital. Here's CTV's senior political correspondent Glenn McGregor on the convoy.
As it pulled onto the Trans-Canada Highway, the massive scale of the convoy was clear, fueled by diesel and millions of dollars in donations through crowdfunding sites. To protest, they said, not just vaccination requirements for truck drivers crossing the Canada-U.S. border.
This is all mandates, restaurant closures, the shot, anything to do with that.
But support among truckers was not universal.
I don't want to associate with crazies, because that's all I see. It's just a bunch of people with nothing better to do.
As the convoy arrived in Ottawa, police were receptive, even helpful, telling drivers where to park. An estimated 18,000 people turned out on a jubilant first day in the deep cold. A small few with swastikas, Confederate flags, and Stars of David.
You don't think it might be offensive to some people you wearing that?
You just know.
In the first week, it became clear the protesters weren't going to leave.
Our departure will be based on the Prime Minister doing what is right, ending all mandates and restrictions on our freedoms.
Early support for the convoy came from a string of Conservative politicians. Current leader Pierre Poilievre delivered coffee and donuts. Their opposition to the Trudeau government echoed on the streets. The constant barrage of truck horns, music, and fireworks chafed on the nerves of people who live and work downtown.
I lost my mind because I haven't slept in 5 days!
Until one resident obtained a court injunction against the honking.
It is quite literally torturous to us.
But the party kept going. The Terry Fox statue was festooned with protest signs. The war memorial used as a toilet. The Prime Minister ignored protesters' demands for a meeting.
We won't give in to those who fly racist flags.
The convoy dug in with saunas, hot tubs, and bouncy castles for the many children believed to be living in the trucks. Restocked by a steady supply of fuel shuttled in while Ottawa police mostly watched. Their embattled chief admitted he didn't have the resources to end what he called an occupation.
There may not be a policing solution to this demonstration.
Parallel protests sprung up at the border crossings in Coutts, Alberta, and Windsor, Ontario, choking off a key supply line for the auto industry and risking tens of millions of dollars of trade every day. Some protesters doubled down on their demand for the Prime Minister to resign, to let them set COVID rules.
I'm willing to sit at a table with the Conservatives and the NDP and the Bloc as a coalition.
Ontario declared an emergency and provincial police moved to clear the Ambassador Bridge. But even with backup from other police forces, still no action to remove the trucks in Ottawa. Then in Coutts, the RCMP discovered an alarming cache of weapons and ammunition not far from the protest site, leading to charges against 4 men for conspiracy to commit murder. On February 14th, the Prime Minister decided to exercise an extraordinary power.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act,
temporarily giving law enforcement broad new powers, including the ability to freeze bank accounts. 4 days later, the police moved in, taking back a key intersection, then reclaiming Parliament Hill.
Hold the line! Hold the line!
Key leaders of the Freedom Convoy movement arrested. One woman was knocked over by mounted police, but the trucks were cleared with no major injuries and no fatalities. Still, the freedom movement continued. Ottawa police were better prepared for a follow-up protest called Rolling Thunder and for Canada Day. The use of the Emergencies Act triggered an automatic public inquiry. Protest leaders insisted their occupation of Ottawa was just.
I have the tears of thousands of Canadians on my shoulder who every day told me that we were bringing them hope.
The Prime Minister, though, resolute in his decision to invoke the law for the first time in its history.
I am absolutely serene and confident that I made the right choice.
Commissioner Paul Rouleau's report on the use of the Emergencies Act will be released by February 20th, the same date some protesters are planning to return to the National Capital for Freedom Convoy 2.0. Glenn McGregor, CTV News.